With 73 fighters released in 2020, fighter turnover in the UFC is the highest it's been for years. And as such, several fighters have seen their tenure cut short for unfair reasons. Today, we look at some of the most unjust cuts in UFC history, from title contenders with strong records to those dismissed for weak actions outside the cage. Welcome to the INC, and these are 5 of the most unfair UFC releases. Liz Carmouche can stake a claim as a women's MMA trailblazer. Carmouche made history in 2013 when she took on Strikeforce champion Ronda Rousey in the UFC's first women's fight, before becoming a respected staple of the company's new bantamweight division. After a successful move to flyweight, Carmouche earned a title shot against Valentina Shevchenko at Fight Night Uruguay. Shevchenko would win a forgettable fight by unanimous decision, and while Carmouche's performance was far from impressive, it came as a shock when the UFC announced they'd released the veteran that December. This despite Carmouche having just signed a new contract and still being ranked in the division's top 3.
I'm constantly contacting, trying to get an opponent, and told either everybody's turned me down, which to me is ridiculous because I've been broken, torn, injured, and I've been told I'm not allowed to turn down fights, but multiple people have been able to with me, which doesn't seem fair. But they keep bringing in people from different organizations that they're hoping they're going to build up, and I just keep knocking them down. So really, there's not much of an opportunity other than the fight for the belt again, which I know that they're not willing to do at this moment. So it gives me a chance to go see what else is out there.
The UFC also came under fire for the timing of their decision, as Carmouche had been working in an ambassadorial role for the UFC as part of their celebration of America's veterans. Carmouche having spent 5 years in the Marines and serving 3 terms in Iraq. Carmouche was signed by Bellator shortly after her release, claiming her first stoppage in 7 years with a win over Deanna Bennett at Bellator 246. For nearly a decade, John Fitch was a staple of the UFC welterweight division. Fitch was long considered one of welterweight's most dominant fighters, boasting one of the longest win streaks in division history, and long considered the number 2 fighter behind the legendary Georges St. Pierre. So it surprised many when Fitch was one of a number of high-profile fighters released by the UFC in February of 2013. Many questioned why Fitch was cut by the company despite his 14-3 record. Some suggested a drop in form culminating in a loss to Damian Maia, while others pointed to reports claiming he was one of the highest-earning fighters on the roster. For most casual fans, however, the reason was simple. He was just too boring.
If I want to fall asleep and I can't get to sleep at night, I'll put in a John Fitch fight.
The move wasn't the first time the UFC tried to cut Fitch. In 2008, Fitch was briefly released from the UFC after failing to hand over his likeness for the UFC video game. The matter was quickly resolved, and Fitch re-signed to the company within 24 hours. Fitch wasn't 2013's only victim. Jake Shields and Yushin Okami were both released from their contracts shortly after Fitch's dismissal. Both fighters were also former title challengers, criticized by fans for their dull fighting styles. Fitch competed for Bellator and the World Series of Fighting before announcing his retirement in 2020, and is currently involved in a class action lawsuit against the UFC. So don't expect him in the Hall of Fame anytime. Unfair releases aren't solely reserved for fighters. Jacob "Stitch" Duran had worked as a cut man for the UFC since 2001, and was regarded by fighters and peers for being one of the best professionals in his industry. In 2015, the UFC announced a deal with sportswear firm Reebok, forcing fighters to only wear Reebok merchandise and forego any personal sponsorship deals. While Reebok compensated fighters for their loss of sponsorship, cutmen weren't afforded such luxury, leading Duran to speak out against the deal on social media.
Listen, I got to take care of my family, and if they were not going to give us sponsorship monies and wanted us to wear Reebok, to me, on a business aspect, that doesn't make sense, and that's what I relayed in the interview, and I got bashed because of that.
Duran was released from his UFC contract that July, sparking uproar from fans and fighters in the process, and leading Dana White to deliver one of the most infamous barbs of all time.
Stitch Duran and I were never friends. We were work associates. We came up together in the boxing world, and when we hired Cutman, he was one of the guys that I brought in here. Friends are people you call on the phone, you hang out with, you talk to all the time. Don House, who's one of our Cutmen, he and I were very close and still are, but Stitch Duran was never my friend.
Duran has since found work with Bellator and the PFL, as well as boxing events. most recently working with Tyson Fury during his win over Deontay Wilder in 2020. Leslie Smith fell foul of the UFC's wrath in 2018. Smith has been an MMA veteran since 2009, holding notable wins over Raquel Pennington and Irene Aldana, and is considered by many fans to be one of the toughest female fighters in the sport. Despite this, Smith was often at loggerheads with the UFC brass, most notably for her role in Project Spearhead, which called for the unionization of professional fighters. The issues came to a head when Smith was booked to face rising star Aspen Ladd at Fight Night Atlantic City. Ladd, known for her issues making weight, failed to make the 135-pound limit, and after Smith turned down the offer of a catchweight bout, the bout was scrapped from the event. Rather than reschedule the fight, the UFC chose to pay Smith her full fight purse, declaring the fight as her final match on her contract and immediately axing her from the promotion.
I guess in a way I was almost maybe hoping that Project Spirit would be significant enough for them to be a little bit worried about it. And then the fact that they did this unprecedented thing where they bought out my contract so that I wouldn't be around anymore kind of shows that they do think Project Spearhead is pretty significant.
Smith was riding a 3-fight winning streak in bantamweight at that time, and her dismissal further hampered a division considered one of the weakest in the UFC. Ironically, Ladd herself took Smith's place in the top 10 when the rankings were updated the following week. Smith has since signed with Bellator, where she currently holds a 2-1 record and continues to remain one of the biggest advocates for fighter unionization. This last segment is devoted to the UFC's Flyweight Division. The UFC has long had a love-hate relationship with Flyweight. While known for its fast-paced matches, the division was ridiculed for being one of the least popular in the UFC. And after longtime champ Demetrius Johnson was traded to one championship, plans were put in place for the UFC to shut down the division. Throughout 2018, flyweight fights became a battle for survival, with winning fighters retaining their place in the UFC, while the losers were axed, regardless of form or performance. Several of the division's notable fighters were axed during this spell, and by the end of 2018, the UFC were left with just 11 flyweights on its roster. It wasn't until the emergence of Henry Cejudo that the UFC reversed plans to close the division. But while the likes of Brandon Moreno were eventually re-signed, names including Dustin Ortiz, Jared Brooks, and Sergio Pettis never returned to the promotion. Flyweight cuts entered the news again in November, when 5th-ranked Jussier Formiga was released from the promotion despite holding a recent win over current champ Davison Figueiredo. The flyweight division remains one of the most divisive in modern MMA, and at the time of writing, still remains on the UFC roster. And now, time for a few honorable mentions. Ring girl Shandella Powell was axed in 2012 after nude photos of her began to circulate online. It's safe to say the company's attitude to this has softened in recent years. Jason High was cut from the UFC after pushing an official during a match. Gilbert Yvel was hired by the UFC after punching an official during a match. Justin Willis was released after the UFC deemed him too overweight, although it did give us the greatest moment of Curtis Blade's career.
Big Titty, go home. Go home, work on your wrestling. Go home.
This is the INC. Support the channel on Patreon.